5. An unexpected party. Jack dreamed. He didn't have peaceful dreams. They were haunted by a figure, half man, half horse, which lay with shattered limb and then burst into flames. The fire spread from the centaur and engulfed Jack too, until his vision was blurred by the heat. Eventually, it shifted to a red haze, which became the sun shining through closed eyelids. He opened his eyes and sat up in bed. He reached across to the bedside table and picked up his watch, gazing blearily at the face until the hands became unblurred. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The bed on the far side of the small table was empty, but showed signs of having been slept in. Jack stood up and stretched. Pulling a toothbrush from his rucksack, he left the room and went through the door across the landing into the bathroom. He brushed his teeth and spat out the disgusting taste that lingered in his mouth from the night before. A dash of cold water across his face brought the world into sharper focus, and after a brief sojourn on the lavatory, he stepped into the blissful embrace of a warm shower. Working up a fine lather all over his body, he thought over the events of the previous evening. As they had walked back into Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwyrndrobwllllantysiliogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogo centaur. The details were vague, but the centaur's name had been Chiron, and he claimed to have come from a gateway between some stones. He had repeatedly mentioned other names, and in his delirium had cursed and ranted against someone called Aron, but no other details had emerged. When Jack and David had reached the Black Swan, they had booked a room, bought several cans of Newcastle Brown, and then retired to their room to discuss what course of action they should take. They had sat up talking into the early hours of the morning, and had decided that they would register a complaint at the nearest police station, which close examination of their map revealed was at Gwydir, and then tried to seek out the place that had a stone gateway. Jack towed himself dry, and felt that a great deal of the tension in his muscles had been washed away along with the dirt of travel. He strolled back across the landing, and found David waiting for him. "Well?" "Well, what?" "What have you done?" Jack asked. He began to pull on his clothes. "I called the police in Gwydir, and they weren't interested. I called a detective inspector in Swansea, and he wasn't interested. And I called the chief constable of Clyde, and he wasn't interested. I did, though, manage to get the landlord to give us breakfast." He looked at his watch. 7 hours late. "Good stuff," Jack congratulated him. "But nobody wanted to know about the centaur?" "It isn't easy persuading people to take a complaint against a policeman who's burnt a centaur to death seriously," David complained. Jack nodded. "I did try to find out about a government research station around here, but no luck." "Hardly surprising." "No, that was just a load of bull he was spinning us. I guess the thing to do is see if we can find out where Chiron really did come from." "Yeah," agreed Jack, tugging a sweater over his head. He pulled it down tight and then spread its edge, revealing a picture of a sheepdog tracking a sheep. "What do you think?" "Very cute, yes. A stone gateway, it's not much. We'll just have to have a scout around, see what we can find." "Are you sure there was nothing else he said that might give us a bit more idea?" "Like I said, he was babbling most of the time. I didn't pay much attention after a while. He said, no, nothing else." "We'll see about this meal then, shall we? Then look around for somewhere to camp, and we can look for those stones at the same time." They shared their meal with the landlord. He had cooked up a rich, thick stew for his own purposes, and welcomed their company whilst eating it. After they had eaten, they sat in the bar and washed down the meal with a couple of drinks. When they stepped outside, after a day without rain, the skies opened and a torrential downpour started. They rushed over to the post office and tried in vain to purchase a large-scale map of the area. With this line of attack thwarted, the two Americans attempted to work out a logical method of looking for a gate between two stones. They reasoned that it must be on a road somewhere, and that it was most probably to the west of Llanfair, as that was where they had found the centaur. With this in mind, they set off along the road to Gwydir. As they left the post office, Jack saw a figure standing on the east road out of the village. It looked like it might be the policeman, but, as he had no intention of renewing that acquaintance, he paid no attention. "I sent a postcard to Mum this morning," David told him as they walked along. "Oh, yes." Jack brushed away the rainwater that was gathering in his fringe and plastering his hair against his forehead. "Yeah, I thought I ought to. Well, actually, I found the postcard in the drawer in the bedroom. Didn't want to put it to waste." They took a few more strides in silence, and then Jack spoke up. "You know, David, maybe we should just forget about last night. Get away from here." "No way, Jack. That was murder last night. Just because the police don't want to know doesn't mean that we should ignore it. Hey, don't forget that he spoke to me. He was a real person." "I guess you're right. Damn, if only I hadn't seen that policeman. Hey, I've just thought of something. That vet I called. Maybe we should still get him to have a look at the body." "If it's still there?" "What do you mean?" "Well, if that policeman was trying to cover something up, he's not going to leave it lying around so that we can go showing it to anyone." Jack nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, I guess you're right." He looked up from the road. "Hey, there's someone coming." David looked up and saw that there was indeed an old man heading down the road towards them. When they drew level, David gave a cheerful smile and said, "Good afternoon, sir. Do you think you could help us?" "What can I do for you, boys?" the old man asked. There was a note of distrust in his voice. Jack vaguely recognised him as the occupant of the bench outside the pub. "We're looking for something, a gateway made of stone. I don't suppose you'd know of anything like that?" "Well, there's lots of gates around here, but only the posts are made of stone, see?" "I guess so. Thanks very much anyway." The old man smiled at them. "Good luck, boys. I hope you find what you're looking for." He tottered off down the hill. "He's right, you know," Jack said. "It is a bit of a hopeless cause." David clapped him on the shoulder. "Yeah, but it's worth it, isn't it?" Janet stood at her kitchen table and kneaded the pastry firmly with her knuckles, then formed it into a ball and pressed down on it again. It very nearly had the consistency she wanted. Just a couple more turns and it would be ready. She dipped a hand into the box of flour and sprinkled a light dusting onto the surface. Then she ran her hand up and down the rolling pin to give that a covering of flour as well. With a few passes, the pastry was thin enough to use, and she carefully lifted it into the dish. A knife trimmed the excess edges off neatly, and she picked up the bowl of filling that she had prepared some months earlier and froze for later use. There came a loud hammering at the front door. Janet sighed, quickly washed her hands, hung her apron over the back of a chair, and then went to see who could be so anxious to get in. The banging didn't stop in all the time it took her to get to the door. "What is it?" she asked irritably as she pulled the door open. She gave a gasp as two figures fell through into the hall. She closed the door and turned round, but both had already gone into the living room. She hurried after them. "Dr. Ace, what's going on? What's happened to your clothes?" Concern tinged her voice. Neither were dressed as they had been when they had left that morning. Their clothes had been replaced by what appeared to be old potato sacks secured around their waists by thin, tatty pieces of leather. The doctor was wearing knee-high calfskin boots, stained with mud and blades of grass, and Ace's feet were bare. Ace had fallen in front of the fire and was now huddling up close to it while the doctor leant against the wall by the window. He gave an anxious look outside. His breath was shallow and quick, and his arms trembled. "What's happened to you? You need something warm in you. I'll be back in a moment." She hurried through to the kitchen, quickly emptied a tin of soup into a saucepan, and put it on the hot plate of the Aga. She went to the back door and called up to the shed. Hugh, come here quickly. It's the doctor and Ace. Something's happened to them." Hugh appeared at the door of the shed. "What's that? Where are they?" "In here. They've just turned up now. Come quickly, love. There's something the matter with them." "Right-ho." He hurried down and followed her inside. "Something's happened to their clothes, and they wouldn't say anything to me. Go and look. They're in the front room." Hugh went through, and Janet gave the soup a couple of stirs. Hugh came back in. "I think we'd better put them to bed and get the doctor in to see them." "I'll just give them this soup, then." She poured it into 2 mugs and carried them into the living room. Ace was curled up now, her hands hiding her head. The way she lay by the fire reminded Janet of something. "Hugh, have you seen Badger anywhere?" she asked her husband as she knelt at Ace's side. "Here you are, love. Try and drink this." Ace took the cup reluctantly, and then clutched it to herself, spilling the hot liquid onto her front. "Careful, love, careful," Janet chided softly. "Come and sit down and drink this," Hugh told the doctor. He guided the doctor to a chair, but could not persuade him to drink. Janet and Hugh stood in the doorway and watched the 2 shivering figures. "What on earth do you think can have happened to them?" Janet wondered. Hugh looked at them. "Their minds seem to be in retreat from something," he said. "I'm going to call young Dr. Snape. Why don't you put them into bed? Try to keep them warm." Ace shivered. With a hefty blow, David hammered the last peg home and climbed inside the tent. "Snug as a bug," he announced. Jack crawled in. "Ugh," he said. "Not as snug as these bugs." Hundreds of small black bodies, casualties of suffocation, littered the walls and floor of the tent. "Mosquitoes," David commented, scraping a tiny corpse off the canvas. "The bane of every camper. They bite you when you sleep and turn your tent into a morgue when you're awake. So much for insect repellent." They had wandered along the Gwydir road looking for a gate, but, despite a couple of promising starts, had been unable to come up with anywhere that looked like a potential source of centaurs. One of the particularly unsuccessful missions through a stone gateway had led them along 2 miles of dirt track to a tiny cottage inhabited by an old woman who chased them away with a broom handle, and then, from a distance, swore at them in Welsh. When the sky had begun to grow dark, they had turned back towards Llanfair Caerog, still determined to find the gateway, and had decided to pitch their tent in a field for the night. They had always been told that they should ask permission if they were going to camp in a field, but it was shielded from the road by a screen of trees, and there didn't appear to be a farm in sight, so they didn't bother. With a flourish, David hurled his sleeping bag along the tent while keeping hold of one end, so that it unrolled itself and lay ready for him. Jack spread his out more sedately, and both of them stripped down to shorts and t-shirts in preparation to sleeping. They pushed their clothes into their rucksacks, which were propped up against each other at the closed end of the tent. Jack squirmed into his sleeping bag and then writhed on the ground, trying to get comfortable. "Come on, David, let's get some sleep." David zipped the tent shut and pulled his bag up around him. He reached out an arm and switched off the torch. They lay there in the darkness, listening to each other's breathing. The sound of a car passing drifted down from the road, and in the distance they could hear the stream trickling between its stones. Soft night noises gradually became evident, lulling the 2 Americans towards sleep. Jack slipped into the semi-doze that comes before true sleep, and in his mind's eye found himself skating on an icy pond like a figure by Bruegel. "Hey!" Jack smashed through the ice at the sound of David's voice and jolted awake. "Did you hear that?" said David. "What?" Jack asked. "I thought I heard a voice nearby." "You didn't hear anything. You were probably dreaming." "No, I was wide awake. I was thinking." "Ha!" Jack snorted. "You must have been dreaming. Be quiet a moment, Jack. Suddenly, the tent collapsed and Jack felt himself being smothered by the folds of canvas as hands grabbed at him. There came the sound of tent material tearing and voices raised in Welsh. Lights flashed in Jack's head as something struck him. He vaguely heard David crying out, but he couldn't rise. Slowly his limbs eased themselves back into action, and he heard the voices retreating, but David was still shouting. He struggled from the confines of his sleeping bag and stood looking around wildly. Headlamps glared in his eyes, and he dimly saw the shape of a van pulling away. He ran after it, but it was accelerating, and he hadn't a hope of catching it. But still he ran, following it into the road. The gravel stabbed into his bare feet, and he winced from the pain. There was a screeching of brakes, and Jack stopped, watching the van disappear into the night. He turned to face the sound of the voice behind him. "What the hell do you think you're doing, lad? At your age, you should know better than to throw yourself in front of cars." A massive figure stood half in, half out of the car that had come to a halt behind Jack. The bright light from the headlamps made it difficult to make out the details of the man's face, and Jack tried to shield his eyes as his head began to throb. "Now, why don't you tell me what's going on?" Hugh stood over the doctor and looked down. Dr. Snape had been and gone. He had been puzzled by what he had seen, but had said that the doctor and Ace both appeared to be sleeping normally now. There were some signs of malnutrition, he had said, and had recommended that they go and see their own doctors as soon as possible. He had assured Janet and Hugh that it was only a matter of time before they woke up. Janet came in and stood by Hugh. He put his arm around her shoulders and drew her close to his side. Something about the doctor made him shiver, and he wanted to feel the comforting warmth of his wife's body. "Look," he said. "His eyes are moving under his eyelids. I read about that once. It's called rapid eye movement. It means he's dreaming." "Where do you read that, love?" "Reader's Digest, I should think." He gave an embarrassed shrug. "Must have been at the dentist." Janet looked at the doctor and sighed. "I wonder what he's dreaming about."